Behold, punks, the champion of Warhammer the Old World. These are the spoils of victory from the London Grand Tournament 2024, where I scored 5 straight wins and 90 out of a possible 100 tournament points, a full 90 points ahead of the nearest punk who dared oppose me. So, those old world punks have been discussing the meta munchkin. How do I build the invincible dragon? Do I have 2 dragons or 3? How can I get 6 magic missiles into my army? How do I put so much 360 on the table that I might as well be playing 40k? I heard them gabbling on my approach and blipped my throttle. When my engine roared, every man jack of them knew they were beaten from the start, and so punk it proved. So, herein I shall give you the complete and unbiased account of exactly what happened. I wish I could tell you stories of near struggles, of good snatching victory from the jaws of evil, of heroic last stands by the forces of light. Instead, prepare yourself for a brutal and relentless cacophony. Funeral dirge mixed with speed metal as my enemies were ploughed 6 feet under before they even knew they were in chains. So, let's calm down for a moment and talk about the streets. There has been much chin-wagging as to how Dr. Blaxill achieved such a feat. Was it his broken Bretonnians, the Green Knight Goss plan with Hill support, the Politburo of Pegasi? Maybe it was the Duke with his Madame 360 guillotine, beheading counter-revolutionaries from all sides. I wonder how he did it. What's that, young man? Are you calling me a meta-rider? The man who'd played Bretonnia for decades while they were the worst faction in the game before you had even crashed your first tricycle? I played third out on the Berlin Wall, punks, before you even existed. Real battles from the burning heart of history. Battles which made us men, compared to which your pathetic millennial exploits of 3D printers, contrast paint, and metaliths look like studio pot plants. Right. Now you're in your place. Watch and learn. So, here are my 2,000 points of Bretonnians for this London Grand Tournament. I must apologise in advance to those who perhaps expected to see some variety in what I was bringing compared to my last tournament battle report. I'm afraid there's precious little of that. Why? Because if you're playing competitively in what I think is a very flat meta, it doesn't really make sense to change what already works. So, first and foremost, we've got the General, Claude Vollier, the young Duke. This is a Bretonnian Duke with the Grail Vow, the Virtue of Heroism, the Grommel Greathelm, Surian's Locket, and the Gauntlet of the Jewel. He's riding a royal Pegasus. The Duke is perhaps the greatest warrior of his age. He has never actually died on a gaming table, apart from on one occasion, 4 times in a day against my regular opponent, Nav the Master Hussein, but we won't mention that. So, this Duke beheads all his opponents automatically on a roll of 6 to wound by dint of his virtue of heroism. His Grommel Greathelm gives him excellent survivability, and that Surian's Locket makes him immune to multi-wound attacks. This Duke is of course the hard counter to dragons, and he can win games on his own against certain opposition. Next we've got the Green Knight. Oh yes, the man in green is back. One of the most powerful things in the whole of the game. The Green Knight can appear and charge on the same turn, as well as having one of those pleasant 360-degree charge arcs. What is more, the organisers of this competition have taken the rather eclectic decision to allow hills to count as natural terrain. That means that the Green Knight will have no less than 4 entry points per battlefield, or maybe more if my opponents cast the Pillar of Fire. Yes, you heard that right, he can really come out of the Fire Pillar. Next we've got Fleur, my level 4 prophetess on a horse. This time she's running battle magic, as she really should have done in my last tournament report. Her primary objective isn't really so much to cast spells. It's to sit in the middle of the battlefield and give me that 50-50 chance of being able to dispel my opponent's conjurations. Finally, we've got Repanse, my battle standard bearer riding a Royal Pegasus. Now, I have changed her build. Last time she had the virtue of the ideal, but now she's got the virtue of confidence and a war banner. The objective here is to go into challenges using another excellent item that she and the Duke both have, the Gauntlet of the Duel. Repanse is there to win combats and to escape into challenges where I don't want the opponents swinging at her. She's a bit cheaper than the last version of her that I brought, but I think she's going to do a better job. That's 50% of my 2,000 points spent on heroes, which is what you're going to see in more or less each and every competitive old world list. Next on to our core, and we've got 3 units of knights. These are primarily to add occasional supporting impact in combat and to run away and not die. My final core choice is 10 skirmishing peasant bowmen. Pretty rubbish, but you've got to have 1 unit of peasants in your army. Then on to special, and we've got 2 units of 3 Pegasi with full command. These are absolutely lightning fast 360 degree supermen of Warhammer the Old World. Them, along with the Duke, Repanse and Green Knight, are going to do the vast majority of my fighting. Next, we've got some mounted yeomen. I've only got 5 of these and I don't expect them to do much, but they're there so Fleur can ride with them and get a reserve move. Finally, I've got 5 skirmishing squires. These have got scout and I hope to be able to use them for chaff clearance. I brought 3 units of these last time and I am a partial fan of them, but I think 1 is probably going to do just fine. It's not an army I'm afraid I think is very interesting. The only way it could be improved would be to push another unit of Pegasi into it, but quite frankly, I can't grow the beard long enough to be able to do that quite yet. This Bretonnian army obviously excels when it comes to dueling monsters and individual heroes. It does certainly have some weaknesses. The Scream Vampire Counts list, a Tomb King grind fest, Linehammer dwarves with loads of shooting, these are all things I absolutely don't want to face. Right, so I pack them in the bag, there aren't very many models after all, and head over to the Lee Valley Athletics Centre where this London Grand Tournament is happening.
Alright punks, here's game 1. My opponent is Fraser Lowry. He's got some wood elves and here we are all deployed. Mostly his army all skirmishes, just like in the good old days for the folk of Lauren. But unlike the good old days, so does most of my Bretonnian counterforce. As you can see, I haven't tried anything funky with deployment. I've gone heavy on the right-hand side with my 2 Pegasus Knight units, but I've got Claude Vollier and Repanse there in the centre, so they can threaten the largest amount of the field. My Green Knight has also got excellent potential table coverage, with no less than 5 pieces of terrain from which he can emerge. My knight units are more or less covering each other in the centre, and I've deployed Fleur in that unit of mounted yeomen behind my own peasant bowman to give her some cover when the wood elves get the first turn. As far as the folk of Lauren are concerned, well, most of their power is there in that unit of warhawks. There are 2 characters who are accompanying that, a general with the ogre blade, and also a level 2 wizard with the ruby ring of ruin. It's deployed as 1 big unit, so it looks as though Fraser's got something of a bird star. Most of Fraser's corps, as you would expect, are Glade Guard, and these archers have all got the Hagbane tips. This is probably less good against Bretonnian than the Arcane Bodkins, but his level 4 wizard, who is hiding in one of those larger pickets of elves in the wood, does have the elementalist spell Plague of Rust, and so I think Fraser's going to be relying on that to do the bulk of his damage with his shooting. He's got 3 Tree King there in front of those Warhawk riders, and then 10 skirmishing dryads. There's also a Treeman there on the left-hand side of the battlefield. These guys have only got movement 5 and no swift stride, and so I think I have a very good chance of simply being able to outmaneuver this guy and stop him featuring in the game. Behind that building there on the left-hand side, there's also a unit of I think around 10 War Dancers. They're led by a Shadow Dancer with the Spear of Loek. That has Killing Blow and is really one of the only dangerous things I think in Fraser's army that my characters want to avoid fighting. 2 units of scouts are dropped on the table. Fraser's got 1 unit of Deepwood Scouts, which you can see there on the hill on the left-hand side. I've also got my own unit of Squires there, who are also probably around 12 or 13 inches north of them, there to try and get in the way of those War Dancers. Spell-wise, Fleur's got Arcane Urgency, Fireball, the Lady's Gift, and the Curse of Arrow Attraction. On the other side of the table, Fraser's got Plague of Rust, Wind Blast, Summon Elemental Spirit, and Tree Singing. There is also a scenario in this battle. This is called Breaking Point. I confess I didn't really read the rules properly on this first before the game began. But once you eliminate 3/4 of your opponent's models, you get a bonus of 400 victory points and the game just simply ends. From a competitive perspective, looking across this battlefield from the saddle of his mounted Pegasus, Claude Vollier is pretty comfortable with what he sees. I don't see anything that should really pose any threat to my Bretonnians. Sure, if Fraser manages to get a Plague of Rust and then shoots me, then I do think he'll be able to do some serious damage. But I've deployed my Pegasus Knights, and my Pegasus riding characters can quite easily just fly onto the right-hand side of the board where there are less in the way of archers. The Warhawk Star with the General with his Ogre Blade ought to be an excellent matchup for the young Duke, because I've got Surian's Locket. I reckon with him and some Pegasus Knights we can destroy that unit easily. It also doesn't have countercharge. Then I expect my flying forces and the Green Knight will simply be able to mop up Fraser's army. As far as the left-hand side of the board is concerned, there's that Tree Man and there are also those War Dancers. I'm not going to move my Blue or my Red Knight units very much and just let them go on a large foot slog. Hopefully by the time they're in a position to threaten me, my Pegasus riding squadron will have already destroyed Fraser's right flank and I can pounce on them. In 8th edition, some of the players that I used to play the most, like Mark Murfield, Scott Seckles and Nav Hussain, all used to use Wood Elves. It could often be a really tough fight. The number of arrows the Wood Elves threw into you, the fact that they all had a generic armor penetration of -1, alongside the forces of Warren's magic, made it a very difficult and bloody encounter. But now in Old World, things have radically shifted in favour of the Bretonnians. So first of all, the Wood Elves don't simply pump out as much shooting power as they used to in the past, even with their arcane bodkins. They just don't have as many shots. And by far more importantly, many of your things in Bretonnia have got 360-degree lines of vision. And so the old Wood Elf tactics of trying to get behind you and beside you, trying to go round your lances with their narrow vision, just doesn't work anymore because you've got so many single charging units that can't be hidden from. I know there are some builds with Wood Elves that involve Sisters of the Thorn and using multiple pillars of fire. Therefore, I wouldn't rule out the possibility that Wood Elves could absolutely give Bretonnian lists a run for their money, but I don't think this is the right list for that. Right, so I'm going to go through these games rather a lot more quickly than I have traditionally been, given that the focus of this video is mainly on gaming rather than telling stories. So, in Fraser's first turn, you can see that the Wood Elf Mage has summoned a tree and placed it there in the middle of the board. It looks nice at any rate. Everyone loves a good pot plant. Especially the Green Knight, who can come out of them. Fraser's shooting phase is very weak. It starts promisingly as the wizard, who is on the right-hand side of that unit of Warhawks, throws out a fireball towards the Pegasus Knights in front of him and inflicts 3 wounds on the riders, bringing one down and wounding another. But all of the remaining arrows across the entirety of the Wood Elf army don't even inflict a scratch on the Bretonnians' armour. What an embarrassment. My turn 1, and this is an absolutely crappy photo, but nonetheless conveys what needs to be conveyed, sees my Pegasus squadron swoop forwards. The one that copped the damage flies right into Fraser's front line, right in front of his 2 archer wedges, one of which contains his level 4 wizard. Meanwhile, the undamaged Pegasus Knight unit goes onto the side of the board. The Duke pushes forwards, and the Green Knight appears in the wood. Repanse, meanwhile, hangs back a bit. Now, of course, this large Warhawk rider unit, which is very dangerous, has of course got a 360-degree charge arc, so you have to be very careful when you're playing against it, because it's very hard to hide from. If Fraser decides to go for the 2-man Pegasus unit, I'm going to bounce through his forces and his tree man, and so I hope I'll just be able to get away. If they go for the Pegasus Knights on the right-hand side of the board, that's a real risk. Reason being, of course, because of that FAQ that they released for skirmishers, which means that your skirmishers have got to get to at least the rank behind the fighting rank, or they just die! And that means that Fraser would be risking his Wood Elf Lord there on the left-hand side of that unit. He'd need literally a 19 to be able to get into the Pegasi. Therefore, I decide to leave them there, and if he does charge me, I'll simply hold, and he'll have to be lucky. What I want him to do, of course, is charge the Duke, who I will countercharge with Because I've got the gauntlet of the duel, that duke will simply be able to escape into a challenge, and he's going to either have to put his lord into me, or a unit champion or a mage. All of those additional attacks from the Warhawks are going to be lost. On the bottom, meanwhile, and I realise it's quite hard to see, I point my Blue Knight units towards Fraser's scouts and also his war dancers who are coming on out of shot. I reform my own archers into a more solid line so I can give Fleur and the yeoman a bit of protection should Fraser decide to shoot her from the front. This is also so I can have Fleur in range for some missiles so I can destroy those Glade Guard who are hiding in the wood by my left-hand flank. As you can see, a combination of Fleur's fireball and some accurately placed arrows from my squires reduced that unit to 2 men. They panic and run to the board edge. Oh, by the way, I lied about those war dancers. They're still cowering behind that building. Right, on Fraser's turn too, he's got a decision to make, and he decides to pile his Warhawk riders into Claude Vollier. The young duke digs his spurs into the side of his poor old Pegasus and spurs the beast into a countercharge. Meanwhile, you can see that Fraser has regrouped his dryads so that he can block the Green Knight's charge path into the side of his treekin. Those war dancers have also started to venture out from behind that building, as you can see on the extreme left. The tree man, meanwhile, plods forwards. Patience is normally a virtue, but I'm not sure if it will be this time. Fraser does a bit better with his shooting this time, and all of his archers and his mage's fireball destroy the 2 Pegasus riders who are on top of him. The combat phase arrives, and Claude Vollier throws down his gauntlet of the duel. The Wood Elf General accepts and manages to wound the young duke twice. Claude whips out his golden lance, and sure enough, there's that magic 6. However, the Wood Elf General's impertinent talisman of protection creates a gleaming aura round his neck, and Claude's lance bounces off. Unfortunately for the Wood Elf, though, Claude's dumb equine mount, which normally passively watches as its master beheads dragon after dragon and merely carries him around, wakes up. It's called a Royal Pegasus for a reason, punks, and its 3 attacks and its 2 stomps smash the Wood Elf General into oblivion. Well, that was a bit embarrassing, but the Wood Elf General's dead. Claude Vollier wins combat by 1, and the Warhawk Star gives ground. In my next turn, Fraser's in big trouble, because those Pegasus Knights that have been on the right-hand board edge and Repanse both connect with the Warhawk Star. Meanwhile, the Green Knight charges those Dryads. Generally speaking, my Knight units move forwards, threatening those War Dancers and trying to lure away that Tree Man, and the Green and Yellow Knights and the Red Knights both follow in the direction of the Pegasi carnage train. In the combat phase, we feel like chicken tonight, and there's an orgy of avian genocide as the level 2 wizard and remaining Warhawk riders are all slaughtered. Actually, one survived. The Duke elected to pursue him and overran into the treekin. In the next combat phase, these are made to fall back in good order using their stubborn and just about stay on the game board. It's quite easy for me to skip forwards to the closing stages of this game to show you how this concluded. As you can see, the Green Knight finished off the Dryads, but only made them give ground. He then decided it would be more optimal to charge those treekin who are cowering on the board edge. Eventually, the man in green slaughters them and they get pushed off the field. Repanse, in the meantime, deals with the remaining Dryads. Claude Vollier is loose, and him and the remaining 2 Pegasus Knights that survived from the earlier stages fly into those archer wedges, and all of the elves are slaughtered. In the middle of the board, those War Dancers are subjected to all of my arrow shots and Fleur's fireball. The closing stages sees them reduced to just a single man and that Shadow Dancer. The Tree Man also clomps around in the middle of the table. By the end of the game, I decide to give him my Peasant Bowman. After he's done smashing them asunder, the man of wood turns round to help his wood elf friends. What seemed but a few minutes to him has been long enough to end a whole dynasty of the Lords of Lorren. All he can do is watch. It's too late. Right, and that was the closing situation. As you can see, I lost very little from my army. My knight units didn't really need to even get into combat and didn't actually do any fighting of their own. My Pegasus Knights, Claude Vollier, Repanse and the Green Knight were enough to destroy all of Fraser's army, as I had predicted. Now, in the end, while this was obviously a storming victory for the Bretonnians, I didn't score the maximum number of tournament points because I actually had really ignored the scenario. The way this works, or at least the way it worked in this tournament, was that the game automatically ended when your opponent dropped below a quarter of his initial model count, and then you got a bonus of 400 victory points. As it happened, I actually killed a lot of very high-value models right at the end of the game, and so we had to resurrect them to work out when exactly Fraser's Wood Elves would have gone under the 25%. This had the effect of turning what would have surely been a 20-0 into only a 17-3 in my favour. But I'm hardly complaining, it was still an emphatic victory. I'm not sure that this game was a particularly good one though from a Warhammer perspective. I don't really know what Fraser could do here. All of my stuff had 360-degree charge arcs, and his shooting was nowhere near powerful enough to destroy me. He had three principal combat threats: the Shadow Dancers and the War Dancers and the Tree Man, which I could avoid, and the General with his Ogre Blade and the Warhawk, which I couldn't. But of course, because of Sirian's Locket, those 2 wounds that the Elven General did to him with the Ogre Blade simply stuck at 1 wound and weren't multiplied into D3. Accordingly, Claude Vollier was able to survive and slaughter his opposite number. In fact, even if he hadn't been able to do so and I'd lost combat, I would have just used the Duke's Stubborn to fall back in good order, and then I would have had a Pegasus Knight unit and Repanse coming into that Warhawk star the next turn. No matter how you slice that, I don't think there's any way the Wood Elves were going to win that. This, by the way, is a reason why I don't like 360-degree arcs of vision. If you don't have those, you can avoid an opponent that will kill you. When there are 360-degree arcs, it just therefore becomes much more of a collision of 2 forces that are inexorably on target locks towards each other, and the guy who has the bigger rocket ends up winning. That's one of the things that we used to avoid with Warhammer Fantasy compared to 40k. We could outmaneuver our opponents because everything had lines of sight. That's why I think, and I have always thought, that the makers of Warhammer the Old World blundered by allowing troops that were any more powerful than basic skirmishing foot troops to have 360-degree arcs of vision. If you ask me, punks, that sort of thing's better left to Warhammer 40,000 and Age of Sigmar. But Fantasy were on square bases for a reason. Right, so on to my game 2, and my opponent is Lee Whiteley, and he's got some orcs and goblins. I think there are definitely going to be a few more challenges for me in this game. He's got 2 large units of Night Goblins. One of those isn't on the board yet, because that's actually an ambusher given our scenario. Both of these units are full of Fanatics. Fanatics are amongst the more broken things there are in Old World. Particularly because I hadn't quite realised just how corrupted they actually were. So, you can dump Fanatics out within 3 inches of a Goblin unit in a command phase, and then move them 2d6. Anything the Fanatic passes through takes d6 strength 5 hits with AP 3. Now the reason these are so powerful is because the Fanatics can be dumped out even when the unit is in combat. They can also be dumped out in any direction. They also, as I found out to my horror in this game, can be dumped out on your turn. That means that the Goblins can march 12 inches forward using a marching column, dump the Fanatic out 3 inches, and then the Fanatic travels 2d6. That's a potential threat range of 27 inches. Now, unlike in previous editions, you can't trigger Fanatics by going within 8 inches of them. The Goblins simply reserve them and then dump them out when they want to. The only way of destroying the Fanatics before they appear is to wipe out the entire unit, and quite frankly, when you're talking about a mob of 30, that ain't gonna happen. Right, so Lee's list also includes some Boar Boys. In this picture here, he's actually deployed them on the hill on the top left side of the board. That's to block that Green Knight. He's got a level 4 Wizard with the Ruby Ring of Ruin and also Elementalism. He's in a unit of 5 Wolf Boys. Aside from that, there are 2 Doom Divers and a mob of Black Orcs, with their assortment of double-handed weapons and hand weapons and shields, which is very hard to keep track of during the game. He's then got 2 characters. One of them is a Goblin War Boss and a giant Cave Squig, with the Walloper's One-Hit Wonder. This magic sword gives the Goblin weapon skill of 10, loads of AP and loads of strength, and loads of initiative. It's a very dangerous weapon, especially if you're a knight. Finally, Lee's got a Black Orc War Boss on a Wyvern. To be honest, it's functionally very similar to a dragon. It's got weapon skill 7, it's got 7 wounds, toughness 6, 3 different kinds of saves, and loads of very high strength attacks. The Wyvern just has 2 wounds less and doesn't have as nasty a Thunderstomp. Anyway, it's not as if I don't have plentiful tools to be able to deal with these monsters in my Bretonnian list, and the Duke is already once again sharpening his golden lance. Lee's Goblin Wizard has got Wind Blast to go with the Ruby Ring of Ruin he's carrying, Plague of Rust, Summon Elemental Spirit, and a Goblin-y spell. Fleur's got Curse of Arrow Attraction, the Pillar of Fire, the Lady's Gift, and Arcane Urgency. This scenario is meeting engagement, which means that the forces can deploy within 12 inches of each other. It's also the one where you have to roll for all of your units, and if you roll a 1, they don't appear on the battlefield. I fail this roll with the Duke and one of my Pegasus Knight units, whereas foresaid Lee fails it with one of his Goblin mobs. I don't like this scenario in competitive play. It's fun for friendly games, but just rolling 1s and stopping things that are integral to your army coming onto the board in turn 1 just turns this into rather a luck fest. Now, one thing I've done during my deployment, which was extremely stupid, is that I placed my Blue Knight unit far too far forwards. I actually got a bit confused when we were putting our deployment lines on the battlefield, and Lee actually was very sporting and said to me, "Are you sure you want to put that there?" I mumbled some kind of sleepy answer, and then proceeded to just put the Knight unit back in exactly the same place it was before. Lee then put down his Black Orc war boss, ready for a turn 1 charge. Now, as is often the case in Warhammer Fantasy, sometimes you make some very stupid moves and end up being rewarded for them by the way things pan out later, and this was absolutely one of those occasions. Sure enough, Lee's Wyvern charges my Blue Knight unit in turn 1. While I pass my terror test, I decide actually to flee off the board with this unit. While it's just surrendering them, without saying boo to a goose, I think they've got absolutely no chance of occupying that Black Orc. Furthermore, if they flee off the board, they'll take their banner with them and save 50 points. Perhaps more to the point, though, sometimes it can be a good idea to just flee off the board rather than face certain death, because of course what can happen is that sometimes your unit might die in your own turn, and then your enemy's going to get to turn round and then charge you somewhere where you don't want him. Because of that, and the point about the banners, sometimes it's best to just run off the table if you're faced with a horrible charge from one of these mighty overpowered heroes. The reason this is good for me, of course, is that unless it's a failed charge where you fail to roll enough to make it to your target, if your opponent flees, you have to move the full distance. That's one of the reasons why the flee move in Warhammer World is ridiculously overpowered. Not only do you move after you rally, your opponent has to go their full distance and you can pull them out of position. Sure enough, that's exactly what happens to Lee's Wyvern, and he ends up with his side facing the wood. In my turn 1, the Green Knight bursts forth from the foliage and slams into his side. Of course, this Wyvern is built for survivability and he doesn't have a magic weapon. The fact that the Green Knight's in the side also makes all the difference. I'm getting +1 combat resolution for that. The Wyvern is close order anyway, and so that means that I'm going to be no worse than drawing combats, and so I'm going to lock the beast in place. If the Green Knight gets lucky, he might be able to do a wound or two to the Wyvern and thus make it take a break test. One way or the other though, if you're a monster without a magic weapon and you've got the Green Knight in your side, you probably aren't doing anything in the rest of the game. Now, in Lee's turn 1, he advanced forwards with one of his Goblin marching columns which got onto the board and shot his Doom Divers. 2 of the Fanatics are released, and one of them ploughs through both Knight units, destroying 2 Red Knights and 3 Green Knights. The Red Knight unit, for reasons I can't fully remember why, I must confess, also panics and flees. Bretonnian turn 1 sees Claude Vollier come back onto the board with the remaining Pegasus Knights and fly in behind the hill on my right. In the middle of the table, my core Knights have more or less been decimated. Fleur has been helping keep one of them alive with the Lady's Gift, but that's not going to help them much longer. Because in the strange physics of Old World, those same physics that allow a dwarf with an axe to chop someone's head off from 5 miles away by telegraphing it down a long line of his comrades, means that you can't actually be seen if you're riding a Royal Pegasus behind a single smelly peasant. Repanse actually marches up behind that little picket of squires. She can't be seen by the Goblin Wizard in front of her, so it's going to be no Windblast or Ruby Rings for him. Meanwhile, she can see plenty of good targets to the side. My unit of Pegasus Knights that were behind the forest decide to fly over it, offering up a potential charge from that line of boar boys, although there'll be a counter-charge coming their way if they do, but also looking at the back of the Wyvern, potentially contemplating some interesting possibilities later. As you can see in the Bretonnian next turn, the Pegasus Knights ride into the back of it. That means they're bringing in an extra 3 combat resolution there because they've also got a banner and a rear. Of course that Wyvern can't fight because I declared a challenge with the Green Knight. The poor Black Orc warhorse and his mount with all of their massive attacks connect with absolutely nothing other than an ethereal green ghost, and those Pegasus Knights in its back make it lose combat by 3. It breaks and we run it down. In the middle of the battlefield, things get messy. The Red Knight unit continues to run. I manage to rally it in a subsequent turn, and I simply ram it behind the hill in my deployment zone to save its points. Meanwhile, those green and yellow knights, which had been protected by the lady's gift in a prior turn, charge the Squig boss with his walloper. Perhaps most ambitiously, and perhaps tactically quite doubtfully, both the Duke and Repanse charge those Black Orcs. Note that goblin mob has now expended its fanatics, and so they're not going to be a danger to us. Those 3 knights against the goblin Squig boss pose Lee an unpleasant question. He decides not to use his Walloper's one-hit wonder, hoping to save it for later. As it transpires, the goblin ends up losing combat, breaking, and is destroyed by the knights. Moving back to the main combat with the Black Orcs. My thinking here is that I can use Repanse's Gauntlet of the Duel to get her out of a combat with the Black Orcs, and possibly into a combat with the BSB. Meanwhile, the Duke can get on with kicking green butt. In the challenge, Repanse, with her virtue of confidence, skewers the Black Orc BSB who is riding a warboar. The Duke also fights well. The Black Orcs use their stubborn to fall back in good order. This is when Lee pulls one of the tricks from the Dr. Blaxill box, and the Black Orcs transform into a line. The Duke and Repanse think they can do it together, and they both pursue. However, miraculously, despite rolling 3d6 each, both of them end up rolling absolutely tiny sums and aren't able to get into the Black Orcs, who bounce through that mob of goblins, thus extending their flee distance. Repanse finishes just a couple of inches in front of the Orcs, and she's going to be staring down the face of 15 attacks. Shiver me timbers, punks! Repanse is more scared of line hammer than 6 pathetic infantry attacks with no step up. Who's surprised? Anyway, the Black Orc line charges into Repanse, and she elects to pursue. Unfortunately, it gets entangled with that goblin mob and isn't able to wheel anywhere. Fortunately for Lee, though, he is able to bring home the bacon. A combination of Windblast, the Ruby Ring of Ruin, and the Pillar of Fire destroy Repanse, who has in any case had her blessing revoked by the lady by her understandable decision to flee from the line of doom. Elsewhere, there's been some tit-for-tat of some missiles, and that goblin wizard has been reduced to just a single buddy. Likewise, my mounted yeomen have also dropped 3 men. On the left-hand side of the board, those boar boys are facing down my Pegasus Knights, which cut down the Black Orc warboss. They don't fancy a charge, for now. In Bretonnian turn 3, an Elementalist casts a magic evocation into the sky, and the clouds clear and the sun streams down through the netting of the gymnasium that we are in, casting shadows all over the battlefield in rather a menacing silhouette. My Green Knight, my Pegasus Knights, and even my skirmishing peasant bowman all charge that mob of goblins which has been loitering around in the middle of the table. This is an absolute slaughterhouse, and we destroy around 20 of the goblins and run down the rest. Claude Vollier, in the meantime, flies into the line of doom, but things don't go his way. He only kills a couple of the Black Orcs, and they damage him. With their close order, their static combat res, and the fact that they've done some damage on the Duke, they actually cause him to fall back in good order most unexpectedly. In the turn after this, they once again damage him to the tune of 2 wounds. With his stubborn loft, the Duke tests on a 7 and breaks. Unfortunately for the line, they're not able to catch him, and the Duke spends the rest of the battle flying around on the right-hand table edge. In the final turns, he hides behind the hill, alongside the Green and Yellow Knight unit and the Red Knight unit, all having a nice picnic away from where Lee's Doomdivers could target them. En route, the Duke has 2 Goblin Doomdivers land smack bang on top of his head. Unfortunately for Lee, well, quite frankly, he deserved to kill the young Duke. Both of the Doomdivers and the strength 8 hits they inflict both bounce off the Duke's hard head and do no damage. Fleur destroys the single goblin who was riding with Lee's Elementalist, leaving the wizard on his own. The 2 mounted yeomen spur their mounts into a charge on his side. Lee's in no position to flee because I've got troops on the other side that will also just cut him down. Unfortunately for the Goblin Wizard, those two peasants managed to skewer him with a combination of their cavalry spears and inbred horses. Meanwhile, we chaff that line of boars with the Green Knight. Lee feels he has no option but to go for it, and while he wins combat by one and causes the man in green to crumble, that's only bought time for the equine squadron of death to laser into them. We fight this combat for a number of turns, and it proves fairly inconclusive. In the end, there is just the orc standard bearer of this unit remaining, who breaks and runs. The closing situation sees 6 black orcs from that tough unit occupying the middle of the table. The goblin mob on their right is also undamaged. Most of the Bretonnian knights have now slinked down into their deployment zone and are hiding. However, counting up the 2 piles of bodies, there are a lot more dead orcs than there are Bretonnians, and in the final analysis, this bloody game finishes a 15-5 victory to me. This was actually a really good game, and it was my favourite of the 5 that I played at the tournament from a competitive perspective. The problem the orcs had was that they weren't able to finish off the Bretonnian units. Lee was very unlucky with the Duke. I think by rights he probably could have killed him, especially because he only had a couple of wounds left and he dropped a Doomdiver on his head twice. Those 2 knight units, the green and yellow one and the red ones, were able to simply hide and avoid taking any further damage. I do think that Lee's Black Orc unit, for a change, given this is an infantry unit, did do quite well in this game. It absorbed my charge from both the Duke and Repanse, and, albeit by using a bit of line hammer, was able to defeat both of them. He was able to finish off Repanse, and perhaps with better luck would have also been able to kill the Duke too. I think where I won this game was not really in the centre of the battlefield, but on the fringes. The fact that I was able to defeat the Black Orc war boss so early was absolutely vital. I was also able, by using the Green Knight, to immobilise that line of boar boys until right at the end of the game. Also, through using a few little sneaky tactics and managing to pierce through Lee's lines, I was able to destroy that Goblin Wizard with his bunker of wolf boys. If you are playing with Bretonnia against a Goblin army that does have fanatics in it, I do think you have to play quite carefully. It's very difficult to stop those fanatics, given that they can dump themselves out on your turn. Their threat range is absolutely enormous. To be honest with you, I don't think that there's a great deal you can really do about fanatics the way they're designed in Warhammer the Old World. You just sort of have to hope your opponent doesn't roll well. The only things you can do, one of which I did not do in this game, is try and position your units in terrain where the fanatics will automatically die if they go. Also, if push comes to shove, just give the fanatics 1 unit to go through rather than 2. 1 is acceptable. When they start going through 2 or 3, then you're going to be taken off very quickly. Needless to say, it does also help to have the Pillar of Fire up your sleeve, which enables you to destroy fanatics once they've been released. Although in reality, I don't find that fanatics do that much damage once they've already had their initial spin, because they are of course then moving randomly. Right, so after that 15-5 victory against the Orcs, I move into round 3. Once again, we're facing another Orc army that's very similar to the one I've just fought. My opponent here is Michael, and once again you can see 2 large fanatic-bearing Night Goblin units. You can also see a Black Orc unit with a BSB on a warboar there in the centre, with 2 Doomdivers behind. Once again, you've got this Black Orc warboss here, who is represented here by Azag the Slaughterer's Wyvern, and an absolutely superbly painted model. Once again, this warboss is one of those who has got 3 different kinds of save. And again, no magic weapon. Well look, it's more or less identical to the list I faced in the last game, so in theory we should have no problem against it. Michael, however, clusters up his army near his board edge. I think he's reasoning that he's got 2 Doomdivers and I don't really have any shooting of my own, so he's happy to hang back. One thing I do get in my own deployment is a quite advantageous position for my 5-man skirmishing squire unit. I get them onto the right-hand side of the battlefield, and I think I might be able to threaten those Doomdivers. As I often do during deployment, I tend to go heavy on one side. What I'm hoping to achieve with this is taking one of those goblin units out of the game, and hopefully only having to deal with 1 set of fanatics. There is an objective in this battle, or at least one of sorts. There's a marker in the middle of the board, which we represent by a small coin. If one of us has a unit within 6 of it at the end of the game and the other doesn't, we gain 200 victory points. Michael's turn 1 is a very quiet one, and really all he does is shoot his Doom Divers. Cognizant of the threat from my squires coming in from his left, he tries to fire at them with one of the Doom Divers. Unfortunately though, this misses. Meanwhile, his other Doom Diver targets my Pegasus Knights on the right hand side and chips off a wound from one of the riders. He also casts a Pillar of Fire and sends it forwards into the forest where my Prophetess Fleur and her 5 mounted yeoman guards are hiding. I should have said that one major difference between Michael and Lee's list is that Michael actually has 2 level 4s. One of them is on Battle Magic and the other one is on Elementalism. The Elementalist has Wind Blast and Plague of Rust and 2 other spells that don't do anything. The Battle Magician, meanwhile, has Fireball, Pillar of Fire, Arcane Urgency and Curse of Cowardly Flight. Fleur has got Fireball, Pillar of Fire, Arcane Urgency and the Lady's Gift. Right, now back to the action. So you can see that really the only piece of aggression that Michael has done on his turn 1 is to move his Wyvern up by the wood. Once again, that seems like another fatal mistake, and in Bretonnian turn 1, the Green Knight crashes through the thicket into the side of the second Wyvern in 2 games. Michael's Pillar of Fire, meanwhile, moves through Fleur's unit and toasts 3 of the yeomen. We now skip forwards to Bretonnian turn 2, and this is where things start getting a bit spicier in this game. The Green Knight has just been bashing the Wyvern and hasn't been able to damage it, but because we've got him in the side, we're continuing to draw combat and thus locking the beast. Fleur has had some trouble with that Pillar of Fire, and it's wiped out all of her mounted yeomen, and so she's having to be a bit clever in trying to survive. However, as you can see, I've decided to make a big decisive charge with a Pegasus Knight unit and 2 Knight units and my own Duke into that Black Orc mob. I'm hoping that's going to be enough to wipe out the vast majority of them, and I'm hoping that Claude can bring down that battle standard bearer on his warboar. I have still higher hopes for that Red Knight unit have also connected with the side of the Wyvern. Of course, once again that Black Orc Big Boss is locked in a challenge with the Green Knight and can't do any damage. My Red Knights are going to be bringing another 2 static combat res into that fight, and so I'm hoping we can do exactly the same to Michael's Wyvern that we did to Lee's and break the beast. My Pegasus Knights and Repanse skirt up the other side of the board. Repanse in particular I think is in quite a good position because she's sitting on top of all of the Goblin war machines. Now I do realise that Michael can dump out his Fanatics, and if he wants to kill Repanse then he probably can, but he's going to have to send his Fanatics off the board. As I said before, Fanatics are tremendously difficult to defend against, in fact impossible to defend against unless you've got a piece of terrain there, so it's really just a question of accepting they're going to do some damage and then trying to minimise it by only giving them a single unit. You'll see that Repanse has got the Lady's Gift on her, and that's going to give her another 5-up ward save or regeneration save if Michael does decide to use his Fanatics to destroy her. At least then he's going to need a 4 to wound her because of her toughness of 5, and she's going to be saving on a 6-up, 5-up, 5-up, and so she's going to be quite hard for him to take down. Right, so we've got the combat here in the centre, and Claude Vollier successfully decapitates that Black Orc BSB. My remaining Knight unit and the Pegasi cut down around half of the Black Orcs. There are 9 of them left, and they use their stubborn to fall back in good order. Unfortunately though, we've got close to that other Goblin mob. As you can see in Michael's next turn, we get subjected to the full hail of Fanatics. Now Michael is not very lucky with them, they actually don't go that far, but it's still more than enough to completely destroy the Pegasus Knight units and to knock the Blue Knight unit down to just a single man. The young Duke also takes 3 wounds in this whirling dervish fest. In the combat phase, that Black Orc Big Boss, who is now testing on 7s to try and stay in the fight against his ethereal opponent, fails his break test. However, rather fortunately for Michael, the Black Orc bounces over troops in his way, and I'm not able to pursue him. He ends up grounded behind that building, but still fleeing. Eventually, the Black Orcs are eliminated in combat, although they fight to the last man. In a subsequent turn, I use the Duke to make the Wyvern flee again, and it flees over the building, but still just enough to keep it on the table. I also declare a charge with my squires into the beast. They're 9 inches away from the fleeing boss on the side of the table, and they just need 1 5 on their 2 dice to be able to connect with him and be absolute heroes. Unfortunately, the dice come out low, and the squires come within spitting distance of irredeemable glory. In a subsequent turn, that Black Orc Warboss completes his extremely lucky escape and manages to rally. I don't have any more photos from this game, unfortunately, so I'm going to have to describe, although I think this image will serve for me to describe the ending situation quite well. My final Blue Knight is destroyed by a magic missile from that Goblin unit. You'll note that both of Michael's level 4s have actually abandoned their respective positions and have gone to take up station in that undamaged unit of goblins. This is good play here, thinking about moving your wizards from unit to unit. Repanse, meanwhile, is loose, and she's able to hoover up all 3 war machines on the Orc back line, and they don't do any more significant damage. The other Goblin unit on the left-hand side surges forward and dumps out its fanatics into my Pegasus Knights. The whirling dervishes scythe through them, and the Pegasi scream as they are reduced to a horrible blooded mass of feathers. In the remainder of this game, Repanse and Claude Vollier and the Green Knight end up getting their hands dirty against that Goblin unit with both of the level 4 wizards in it. It's a near-run thing because this unit actually has a big boss with Walloper's one-hit wonder, and once again the Duke has a lucky escape. Eventually, my 3 heroes are able to whittle down these goblins, assassinating both level 4s in the process and routing the mob on the last turn. In the middle of the battlefield, my knight units, which once again didn't really get their hands dirty, are easily able to secure that objective and net me another 200 points. I did lose 2 units of Pegasi and a knight unit in this game, but I was more or less able to eliminate most of Michael's army, save that Black Orc Warboss and one of the goblin mobs. This was once again a very decisive victory to the Bretonnians, and it finished 18-2 in my favour. In many respects, perhaps this game wasn't actually that different to the previous one I fought against Lee. In both games, I got a great charge against the Wyvern with my Green Knight and managed to break it. I didn't manage to kill Michael's boss, but I did at least take him out of the game for all extents and purposes. The Doom Divers didn't really do anything once again. I don't actually think they're that great as a war machine if you read the rules literally. And his level 4 wizards, while they did do quite a lot of damage, were probably countered by my Bretonnians' armour. Most of the damage Michael did in the game was with his fanatics and also quite a bit with Pillar of Fire. That managed to destroy 3 of my units. His Black Orc unit though went down a lot easier than Lee's did. I think I was able to bring a bit more force against it. I do think in a certain way Michael probably played this reasonably well. He sat his 2 goblin units next to all his war machines, allowing his fanatics to cover everything. I think his only real key mistake was the positioning of that Black Orc Warboss in turn 1 and getting flank charged by the Green Knight. I should say to my viewers that I am explaining very clearly exactly what the Green Knight does to all of my opponents. Sometimes some of them are blocking him in turn 1 by crowding these terrain features, but quite a lot of the time people do still make mistakes, especially after the initial portions of the game. That's probably something of a debating topic in itself, actually. How far is it sporting for me as the owner of the Green Knight to remind opponents when they place things next to terrain features that my Green Knight can jump out at them? In friendly games, I absolutely would do that, but I don't think it's my place to do that in a tournament. So long as everyone knows what everything does, there has to be an element in competitive Warhammer where one player makes a mistake and another capitalises on it. If that isn't the case, it will often just come down to who brings the better list, and I don't find that kind of meta shaking very interesting. Right, so that's the end of day 1, and I have 3 comfortable wins under my belt. So, one thing I don't want to be facing in day 2 is the undead. I don't want that Scream list that I've seen knocking around on one of the other tables, and I also don't want to fight Tomb Kings either. I depart from the Lee Valley Athletic Centre, ready to get some dinner and some sleep. Let's see what fate has in store for me tomorrow morning. Right, good morning. Looking at the app last night, I thought it would be quite likely that I was going to be drawn against James Ramsey's Bretonnians. However, as it transpires, I am actually paired against Dom de Silva's High Elves. I call them High Elves, but there aren't actually that many elves in the army. Mainly because this list consists of the worst Armageddonic nightmare that everyone was in a tiz about at the beginning of Old World. 2 Star Dragons and 2 Frostheart Phoenixes. Not only is a Star Dragon a dragon, it's also the most nasty of all of the dragons. It does d6 +1 thunderstorms. Also, the High Elves have got that dirty item that gives them a single 2-up ward save, which is going to mean it's very unlikely they're going to be heroically killing blowed. The very small number of elves who have arrived with these monsters are what you might call spectators. Lines of 5 spearmen who stand on the back of the board and watch the dragons destroy their enemies. Better still, these monsters are in the habit of placing themselves on top of each other. What I mean by on top of each other is using the fact that you no longer have to place your troops 1 inch apart as you did in previous editions of the game. This enables players to arrange their monsters touching each other and form up as a grid. This means that in certain circumstances, a charging opponent is obliged to charge both targets rather than merely one of them. Do you fancy 1 Star Dragon, punk, or would you like 2? How about it if Star Dragons and Frostheart Phoenixes were only modular components that could combine to make something larger? So, punks, quail in terror before the abomination of Ultrazord. There are 1,500 points of this elf army combined in those 4 monsters. Now, I do absolutely have the tools to bring the Ultrazord down. Dom's Prince has got that single-use 2+ ward save, and so I'm not going to be able to use my Duke's Monster Slayer ability against him reliably. Once again, this dragon is the Munchkin Survivability Mode dragon. He's got a 2-up armor save, a 5-up ward save, and a 1-use 2-up ward save, and 5-up regen. The rider really isn't kitted out to do any fighting at all, armed with merely a cavalry spear, which Dom jokes is there mainly for poking his dragon, and inspiring it to even more vicious deeds of vengeance. The Wizard's Star Dragon is really just as nasty as the Prince's. This Elf Star Dragon, that's ridden by a wizard, gets toughness 6 instead of the Chaos Warrior one that only gets toughness 5. So he's also, with his 9 wounds and toughness 6, going to be stomping all over me as well, given half the chance. We then come to the 2 central components of the Ultrazord, the double Frostheart Phoenix. Now, the Frostheart isn't what he used to be in 8th edition. He doesn't have a ward save for one thing, and he's not really as interesting. He does have that aura of always strikes last that he used to have back in those days, but he doesn't knock the opponent's strength down. That being said, he's still got toughness 6, a thunder stomp, and plenty of attacks, so he's absolutely another nasty flying monster. As I said, the rest of Dom's army doesn't really bear thinking about. There are 3 units of 5 spearmen who are merely there to fill up the core and not die. There is 1 unit of Silverhelms, and there's also a Lothern Skycutter as well, which you can see there deployed on the left. Like most wizards on top table Warhammer the Old World, both of our wizards are running battle magic, and we end up getting very similar spells. Both of us have Fireball, Arcane Urgency, and Pillar of Fire. Dom, however, also has Arcane Unforging, which is a very powerful elf spell which can destroy magic items within 12 inches of the bearer. Dom's going to be using that to destroy my Green Knight's Dolorous Blade and maybe my Lord Surian's Locket. Now let me be clear, while I'm being rather sarcastic about Dom's army, this isn't to imply any moral superiority on my part. What I'm bringing is also as filthy as hell, even though it's not as obvious a filth as the Double Dragon Ultrazord. So here we are on Bretonnian turn 1. Dom actually takes the decision to allow me to go first, reasoning perhaps that I don't have much shooting and neither does he, so he'd rather see what I do. I advance as shown. For the first time in the tournament, my Green Knight doesn't come on in the first turn, which means I'm a little bit more cautious than I ordinarily would be. My Pegasus Knights, who I originally deployed on the right-hand side to the right of that tower, fly round down the back of the board. The reason for this is because I think these troops are best off going for some of Dom's easier points. He's got that Skycutter, the Silverhelms, and also that unit of Spearmen there on the left-hand side. As far as the Frost Hearts and the Dragons are concerned, I think it's mainly going to be my Duke, the Green Knight, and perhaps Pegasus Knights versus the Frost Hearts. As far as those dragons are concerned, my knights and more or less every other thing in my army are just going to have to run away from them. They're far too difficult to engage. I literally don't think I've ever seen a dragon with a 2-up armor save, 5-up ward and 5-up regen and 9 wounds actually be killed in a game of Warhammer the Old World. You've either got to heroically killing blow it or break it. There's not really too much else that can be done. My ace of trumps, as he really always is obviously my Duke. I'm quite happy for Claude Vollier to engage any of those monsters apart from that prince, because I don't think I'll be able to kill him because of that single-use 2+ ward save. Dom's turn 1 is relatively cautious. He doesn't want to march with his wizard because he wants to cast spells. His Frost Hearts remain locked together as they are for the whole game, trying to benefit from that stack hammer phenomenon that I mentioned earlier. His prince, however, assisted by an arcane urgency, sweeps round the battlefield to place to the right-hand side of that tower to give an excellent range of visibility over the centre of proceedings. Dom's objective is to cover my Duke. If my Duke does go for any of these other targets, that prince will go into him. To be honest, that's probably as good as you can really do if you're trying to defend against a 360-degree flying menace. You can see here also that Dom tries to use these 2 lines of elf spearmen to pack that terrain feature that the Green Knight can appear from, this rather square-shaped hill. He's doing this to try and protect the sides of his monsters. He knows that neither of the dragons have got a magic weapon and the Frost Heart doesn't have magic attacks. In the top right-hand corner of this hill, where the Green Knight could place if he came on, he'd have to maximise against that elven picket line on the left, and that would send him on his overrun away from those 3 monsters. Also, if the Green Knight did charge through those 2 pickets along that tram line, he'd miss the prince. This is very careful play, of course, but it's what you've got to do if you're facing something like the Green Knight. Now, as mentioned, that careful positioning of the prince doesn't actually matter in the end, because Dom's wizard gets arcane urgency off on him, so he's able to scoot round behind that building. Aside from that, there's not really very much to say. Dom's wizard tries a fireball, and there's a bit of shooting, and he drops 3 mounted yeomen. We then go on to Bretonnian turn 2. Now, while Dom has been very careful so far to avoid the worst effects of the Green Knight, he has unfortunately, despite all his careful measuring, made once again one fatal mistake, which is that in getting that arcane urgency and taking that great-looking position by the side of the building, the prince has opened up his flank once again to a charge from the Green Knight. For the 3rd time in 3 games, the man in green bursts forth from a forest and locks a non-magic weapon-wielding dragon or draconic-related creature in the flank. No doubt it's easy to say when you're watching battle reports, what a stupid blunder. However, when you're actually playing in real life, especially when the Green Knight doesn't turn up at the beginning of the game, with so many terrain features that he can come out of, it's a very easy mistake to make. Right, Pegasus Murder Force 1 start hoovering up those lines of elves on the hill, destroying one and then overrunning into the second. Elsewhere, my cavalry units in the shape of the Green and Red Knights are content to push forwards. While they'd only be Dragon or Frostheart feed if they tried to reckon with the power of the Ultrazord, they do fancy like fighting some core elves. My Green Knight unit actually charges a unit of Reavers that were there. Dom elects to flee with it, but ends up fleeing through his Sky Cutter. Unfortunately, this panics and falls back in good order and goes off the table. Unfortunately for those elves, those spectator refugees on the left-hand board edge, they were rather dependent on the Sky Cutter to provide sufficient threat range to deter my knights. Without it there's not much they can do, and they are chased off the board in what's left of the game by my Green Knight wedge. Although she's off-shot, Repanse also skirts round the southern table edge and destroys a second unit of Reavers that Dom has got cowering in the corner. Very swiftly, almost all of the core elves are dead, and we're reduced to just Ultrazord. I should say I'm getting quite lucky with some of my shooting. A fireball from Fleur, a pillar of fire, and also some small arms shooting has done 3 wounds on one Frostheart Phoenix and 2 wounds on another. Now obviously Dom's prince is defenceless against the Green Knight because he's got no magic weapon. However, he does have some assistance in the shape of the Pillar of Fire, which Dom's wizard has been able to place near the champion of Bretonnia. Fleur remains completely unable to get rid of this pillar through the rest of the game, and it moves over the Green Knight time and again. In the final reckoning, the Green Knight takes 3 wounds from the Pillar of Fire, but this isn't enough to bring him down. At a critical moment, Dom moves the Pillar of Fire over him while he's got 1 left in my turn. Unfortunately, the dice come up bad and the Green Knight passes his armor saves and his ward saves. Had Dom been able to destroy the man in green then, his prince would have been able to cut loose in his own turn and make some devastating charges on the centre of the game board. As it transpires, as happened in both of the previous games when the Green Knight locked a dragon in the flank, a Core Knight unit also joins the party. With its +2 static combat res, the dragon, after 3 attempts, fails its break test, and the Bretonnian warhorses, with their re-rolling ones for the finest horsey, run the prince down. Well, that's the 3rd dragon that's perished in exactly the same way in these 3 games, punks. If you're a dragon, you should remember what you were told at school about the Green Cross Code. Look right, look left, and look right again, or be run over. Right, that's the main and most nasty head of Ultrazord down, but there are still 3 parts of it left. The Phoenix stack in the centre moves in lockstep. One day I'm hoping that this plastic rod that frost hearts on competitive Warhammer tables are generally reduced to will be replaced with a 2-pronged plastic rod to allow the user of frost hearts to move both of his glued together phoenixes around simultaneously. Anyway, Claude Vollier obliges and does the simultaneous charge on both Frostheart Phoenixes and enters combat with both of these majestic birds. Of course, stacking these Frosthearts on top of each other does ensure mutual protection, but also at the risk of mutual destruction. The young Duke charges into them, and 2 flashes of gold later, and 2 sixes sees both component parts of the body of Ultrazoid impaled. The rest of this battle can only be described as a calamitous car crash from the High Elves. There's only 1 part of Ultrazord remaining, the wizard on his Star Dragon, and the Duke charges into him. There's an air of inevitability about proceedings, and nobody is surprised as the Duke ruthlessly and brutally beheads the final Star Dragon. That's all 4 parts of Ultrazord down, punks! He never lost in Power Rangers, but he's lost against me. Right, and with that's really the end of the game. This was an incredibly brutal game of Warhammer the Old World. Brutal for 1 player. Of course, the hard counter to this monster fest is the Duke with heroic killing blow and the Green Knight. This was ruthlessly exposed in this encounter, and a double Star Dragon, double Phoenix list which had gone through, Dom told me, around 50 opponents without suffering a single loss was destroyed within 3 turns against the Bretonnians. I know many of you don't like dragons, and especially not double dragon. However, now you've met some pest controllers. Are they worse than the original vermin? Or has something else, something even more horrible been unleashed? While I've been a little bit playful about Dom's list, I should say that he was a fantastic opponent and was very sporting. I could also tell he's a very good player. I know he's a fan of the channel and will be annoyed that he didn't give me a better game. But that's how it rolls sometimes, and there's always a next time. Right, let's move on to Game 5. I've been fortunate in a tournament where Bretonnia was so dominant to not have actually fought the mirror match that I was dreading. Generally, I don't mind mirror matches that much, but not mirror matches when both sides have 360-degree charge arcs, because we can't really avoid each other. Given that, it's probably just going to come down to who's got the slightly better list or who's luckier on the dice, and that's not great Warhammer. Anyway, my opponent here on table 1 for the last round is James Gascoigne, and as you can see, he's got a quite similar Bretonnian army to mine. Similar in some ways, although not in others. He's got loads of Pegasi, I guess who wouldn't, but his Bretonnian army is Exiles. Now this is of course one of the lists that you can use from the Arcane Journal. A really cool idea I think, and definitely adds some variety to the Bretonnian metagame. So, in a competitive sense, what makes exiles worth taking? Well, the first thing is that they can have cannons in the form of the beach-loading bombard. The trebuchet, unfortunately, is absolute garbage in Warhammer the Old World, and I doubt you're ever going to see them. The cannon, or the bombard on the other hand though, that's quite good and well worth including. The other good thing about the exiles is that they have a particularly nasty magic item called the Frontier Axe. This has armor penetration 3, multiple wounds 2, and +2 strength. It's arguably just as good or if not better than the Ogre Blade, and it's less than half the points. In addition to this, exiles all are stubborn. They also reroll all of their leadership tests, including some of those pesky leadership tests like those compulsory overrun checks that can't otherwise be rerolled in Warhammer the Old World. They also can reroll the leadership test that is taken by the bearer of the Falcon Horn of Fredimund, which is a very meta-y Bretonnian magic item which I've decided not to take. Now James absolutely does have this horn, and I've got a lot of flyers he can ground. So, his army is one really large unit of Pegasus Knights, 6 of them. He's also got 2 barons on Royal Pegasi. One has got the virtue of heroism, in other words, a slightly lesser version of the Duke Claude Vollier, and the other has got the Frontier Axe and the virtue of knightly temper for hatred and a bunch more extra attacks. He also has the Green Knight. Remember something else also. When 2 Bretonnian armies face each other, neither side is allowed to pray. Now for the exiles, they don't care because they don't get the blessing anyway. But for normal Bretonnians, where we don't have veteran, we don't have stubborn, and we don't even have that nifty little exiles way of regaining blessings, we just simply lose. Which means that normal Bretonnia versus exiles is inherently a matchup stacked in favour of the latter. James also has a level 3 wizard on dark magic. This wizard has an arcane familiar, which enables her to pick Word of Pain and Battle Lust, which are the 2 spells you absolutely want from dark magic. Fleur, meanwhile, finishes with her preferred loadout of Fireball, Pillar of Fire, Arcane Urgency, and the Lady's Gift. So, this is how we deploy. You can see that huge peg star is there behind the building. The Pegasus to the right with the lance is the Baron with heroic killing blow. The other between those 2 units of Knights of the Realm behind one of the bombards is the Baron with the Frontier Axe and the virtue of knightly temper. Now you'll notice that both of us have packed one of those natural terrain features, or in my case I've actually packed 2. This is to defend against each other's Green Knights appearing in turn 1. Now in this respect my scouts actually give me a little advantage. That little 5-man unit of squires actually is able to place on the front part of that hill that actually sticks out of both of our deployment zones, which is symmetrical. Now, because James doesn't have any scouts, he's not able to defend that hill fully from the Green Knight, but I am. So, we dice it off for first turn. I think this is a role I'm really going to have to win to be able to overcome what is likely to be a quite difficult matchup. Fortunately, the lady smiles on me and I win it. My Green Knight very obligingly turns up at the first time of asking and places himself within the hill on the right-hand side of the table. He's easily able to get a charge into James's peasant bowmen and he routs them. He rolls a double 1 on his overrun, however, but he's still in an excellent position to threaten the side of James's quite clustered together Bretonnian force. Now, of course, I'm worried about James's Green Knight. And my own Pegasus Knights on the right are very cramped up because they know that he can appear out of that square-shaped hill. I must admit I am a bit worried about James's cannons. Not worried with Claude Vollier because he's got Syrian's Locket or with the Green Knight, but I am scared of him cannoning off Repanse. She's only got 3 wounds. Fleur is also quite vulnerable. If that knight unit she's hiding in takes 1 casualty, she'll lose her lookout, sir. However, fundamentally, this game is probably going to come down to a duel between heroes. Now, in these high-level death matches, I think 3 of James' characters can really duel it out. He's got both of his Barons and the Green Knight. I don't think Repanse is quite built to manage this, so really I've only got the man in green and Claude Vollier. But I do think my own Duke is better than either of James's Barons. He's of course got some very important stat upgrades on them. Therefore, I should have the advantage if I duel any of them. That being said, I really don't want to go head-to-head with James's Baron with the virtue of heroism and just turn this whole tournament into who can roll a 6 first. I should mention something else as well. Now, generally, these tournaments are done via the 20-0 scoring system, and I'm at the top of the leaderboard with a lead of about 4 points over James. However, I actually find out that this tournament is not primarily using that to determine who wins. That's only going to be used as a tiebreaker after win-loss draw. That really changes the way I play this game. Had I had a lead of 4 tournament points and I knew that that was the primary metric by which we were going to be deciding who won, I would have castled up in this game and tried to use my advantage to make James come to me. However, because that isn't the case, I've really got to take some risks. Anyway, James's first turn doesn't go that well. One of his bombards misfires and destroys itself. That's very important. With only 1 cannon there, I'm a lot safer. His other cannon does destroy 3 knights, however. James's Green Knight also turns up at the first time of asking, and he decides to put his Green Knight into my Green Knight. I think this was a very good tactical calculation. My Green Knight was in a very predatory position as far as he was concerned, and it made much more sense to go for him. Unfortunately, there's no reply to just simple plain dumb luck, and James's Green Knight completely misses mine, whereas my own man in green goes on a murder fest and beheads him with his dolorous blade in a single round of combat. With James's Green Knight banished, my own Green Knight is able in my turn to charge his Baron who had placed in front of the wood. This is one of these occasions where there can be a landslide effect. One player gets a spike in luck, and then that places him in an advantageous position to use a newly freed up piece in his own turn to do more damage. In this case, the Green Knight isn't just lucky that he can charge the Baron, but also that the Baron is too close to countercharge him. Now, of course, this hero deathmatch between the Green Knight and the Baron is rendered especially Razor-like because both of us have got magical weapons that do multiple wounds 2 and 4 wounds each. Thus, in reality, we've really only got 2 wounds each. Thus, one small spike of luck, one way or the other, will probably end this. I'm lucky in that once again I'm the one that gets it. The first round of combat is a tie at 2 wounds each, but in the second, my Green Knight runs the Baron through with his dolorous blade. This is a really unlucky start to this game from James. The fact that he's lost his Baron means that he's not really able to push my troops back on the right-hand side. My Pegasus Knights, Repanse and my Green Knight unit are able to advance towards his flank, where he's got his larger Knight unit and his Dark Wizard. On the left-hand side of the battlefield, I'm content to use my Duke to try and keep back that enormous squadron of 6 Pegasus Knights. Of course, because I've got the Gauntlet of the Duel on my Duke, James won't be able to refuse a challenge against him, and so it's going to be very difficult for him to bring much to bear. The Pegasus Knights will just have a static combat resolution of 1 because of their banner, so I think if they fight the Duke, I'll probably be able to break the whole unit. Now, in trying to push that Peg Star around with the Duke, I end up flying him too close to the smaller of these Knights of the Realm units. I think my Gauntlet of the Duel was making me a bit too hubristic here. I placed the Duke so close to these Knights that he was out of range of his countercharge. Sure, he'll be able to lock that Knight champion in a duel by using the Gauntlet, but the Knights are still going to be bringing 2 combat res in against him. James goes for this charge and is also assisted by getting a Battle Lust on the unit. While the Duke again slams down his Gauntlet to get out of all of these extra Knight attacks and destroys the Realm Knight champion, he loses combat by 1. I can't afford to take the chance of dicing for a conventional break test, so I use his Stubborn to fall back in good order. That has the effect of opening up his flank to the other Baron, who of course has the virtue of heroism. Given the situation of this game and the situation of the tournament overall, James decides, I think, that he's got to take this charge with his Baron. It's going to be heroic killing blow versus heroic killing blow, but James's Baron will at least strike first. The exiled noble thunders into the side of the young Duke, but hits with only 1 of his attacks. Hoping that the lady will give him something, anything, to get him back in this game, James rolls the dice. It comes up a 5, 1 short of what he would have needed. For his part, the young Duke strikes back, and once again, for literally the umpteenth time in these battle reports, shows an HKB at the first time of asking. The Baron's head flies across the battlefield, rolling in front of the exiles and telling them in no uncertain terms what happens when you betray the lady. James had fallen behind in this game and he had to take a risk to try and get himself back in it, but it hasn't worked, and as a consequence he's just fallen further behind. Really, I'm afraid that sets the tone for the rest of the game. James tries to use his peg star to get in there and does destroy some of my peasants. But later in the piece, my own Pegasus Knights, Repanse and the Duke himself all collide with this enormous squadron of flying horses. Against a maelstrom of all of my remaining force, they collapse and flee off the table. Later in the game, James' Knights units start getting involved with some of mine, and also my Pegasus Knights on the right-hand side. While James's exiled Bretonnians do show some pluck and some valour and enjoy some success and chase off two of my units in these final portions of the game, there's a feeling rather of the band playing on the Titanic, and well as they're fighting, their ship's going down. James's luck is summed up when in his turn 5 his Green Knight bursts forth from the thicket and combines with his outcast wizard on a double flank charge on my remaining knight unit. The Green Knight misses completely and my own knights and horses destroy the outcast damsel. That's enough to beat him in combat by 3 and his Green Knight once again collapses. This time he's not coming back. It's all over. We more or less called it there. It was another thumping 20-0 victory to my Bretonnians. Of course, this is what happens with Hero Hammer. When you're both using characters that are dialed up to the max and you go into near-run death matches and lose them, you can end up collapsing very quickly. In this case, James was unlucky that my Green Knight destroyed his. He was also unlucky that my Baron destroyed his as well. Probably both of these were really 50-50s. Once he found himself behind the 8-ball, he had no choice but to take an increasingly daring series of risks, and they didn't come off. Once a couple of these had gone against him, James knew, as I did, that the game was up. With superb sportsmanship and magnanimity, James then really shifted to making this battle as fun as it possibly could be for both of us, even though the winner was probably already decided. So, with everything over, I finished with 5 wins in 5 games from this London GT and 90 battle points out of a possible 100. Now, of course, I'm delighted to win a major GT and very grateful to the tournament organisers and to my 5 fantastic opponents. However, despite this, I did have mixed feelings about this victory. To start with, and I don't think this was any fault of my opponents, everything just seemed a bit too easy. When I'm narrating these stories of Warhammer battles to you, I like to tell you stories of near-run things, close fights, competitive games, not massacres. In the good old days of 8th edition and in the 9th age, even getting into the top 10 in a grand tournament, especially with my Bretonnians, felt like a massive achievement. In those days, the results of grand tournaments were perhaps decided by only a couple of points at the top. But here, I've come no less than 19 battle points ahead of my second-placed opponent, James Ramsey. It's not just a win, it's an absolute landslide, it's an absolute massacre. From eking out wins against superior opposition by using every cunning ploy I could with my Bretonnians in the days of 8th edition, now I'm tabling opponents left, right and centre in a few turns. Is it just a simple question of Bretonnians being overpowered and needing a nerf? After all, they came first, second, third and fourth, didn't they? With the best will in the world, I don't think it's quite so simple as that. Let's have a chat. When anyone wins a major GT, there will naturally be analysis of that winning list. Before I say something about the state of competitive old world, it would be remiss of me to not remark about that. It's often said that winning games is inherently less interesting than losing them, because it's not obvious what you'd change next time. My list won all 5 of its games, and really rather comfortably. My heroes and my 2 units of Pegasus Knights did almost all the fighting. The Knight units, as you will have seen, were mainly there to run away and not be killed. Occasionally they were useful, principally when they entered combat against those 3 dragons that my Green Knight knocked in the flank. They were able to bring in another couple of combat res on demand and were also good at chasing things down. We'll say something more about that Green Knight later, but suffice to say he was absolutely my MVP. He was fantastic in all of the games. Yes, he was helped by the fact that the organisers decided to allow him to come out of hills rather than merely forests and difficult terrain. But fairly obviously, the fact that you have the ability to charge on the turn when you appear and a 360-degree charge arc makes for an incredibly powerful piece. I was, however, I think quite fortunate in the matchups that I got here. Old World is all about heroes. In this case, none of those heroes had magic weapons, and so the Green Knight was able to lock them. Had they been the other popular build of these heroes, usually wielding the Ogre Blade, he would have had no chance. The Duke Claude Vollier was absolutely incredible. Just as in my previous set of tournament battle reports, he beheaded things left, right and centre. I do think I've been quite fortunate with rolling those sixes when he's entered combat. I realise there's a debate between Bretonnian players on whether you should have the virtue of knightly temper in the Ogre Blade or the virtue of heroism on your Duke. I must admit I'm not the biggest fan of hero wing-wang comparisons in my Warhammer, but insofar as I have a view on it, and I suppose I have to given I'm playing Old World competitively, I'm in favour of the latter. One of the only different things in my army was the build on Repanse my BSB. Last time I gave her the virtue of the ideal. This time I gave her the virtue of confidence and a war banner. She had 2 static combat res and was able to fight very well in challenges. She also, just like the Duke, had the gauntlet of the duel. To be honest, in a tournament where I really learned very little, that was the main takeaway. That 5-point common magic item enables your Bretonnian heroes to escape into challenges. That can sometimes be extremely useful, especially with a paladin. You can just use this piece to get into a challenge regardless of what you're fighting. Given you've got the virtue of confidence, you're usually going to get a couple of points of combat res out of a challenge. That means you're almost certainly, given you've also got first charge, going to be winning the combat. If you're worried about enemy Pegasus Knights, for example, the Gauntlet of the Duel on a relatively modest hero is an excellent way of disposing of them. For those of you who also watched my previous set of tournament battle reports, where I went to the Triple Crown and came second, I'm afraid I don't really have much more in the way of insights to add. The list I'm using is extremely powerful and is disposing of most of its enemies in 3 or 4 turns. The only way I could improve it would be to drop the squires, make a few cuts and try and cram in a 3rd unit of Pegasus Knights. But unfortunately I'm afraid, punks, that's not really me. I have no interest in simply painting more models that I don't care about. I don't like 3D printing. I don't like contrast paints. More fundamentally, I'm not really interested in meta hammering. I'm no still maniac, but I'm interested in using the tools that I've got and trying to use them well. In almost a decade of playing with my Bretonnians competitively, I would sometimes lose games where I felt that I outplayed my opponents, simply because my army wasn't very good. But in Old World, that boot has been comprehensively put on the other foot, and now I find myself playing one of the best armies in the game. I guess I should enjoy this while it lasts. If my army gets nerfed or if new army books are released which are even better, I'm not going to be changing what I'm bringing. Sure, I might go back to Warriors of Chaos or potentially finish off that Wood Elf army I've been painting, but I'm not going to fundamentally change what I'm bringing just to chase the meta. I just don't like that kind of Warhammer. Now that probably sounds like a declaration of moral superiority, but it's not really intended to be. Now there are some people from the more still maniac or fluffy tradition of gaming that just simply think you should collect and paint the models that you love and to hell with what's good. Now that's a view that I respect, but it's not one that I really share. The reason I don't like meta chasing is slightly different. First, I like to paint my troops well, and it takes a long time to be able to bring well painted model soldiers to the gaming table. Meta changes too quickly for me to be able to react to it with my paintbrush. So apart from a few things here or there, I don't intend to do so. More to the point though, there's a gaming reason why I don't like meta chasing. I like what decides a game of Warhammer to be the decisions that are made on the tabletop. Deployment, chaffing, unit trading, clever use of resources with magic, picking the right fights against the right foes, strategic fleeing, and the capturing and securing of objectives. All of these things really disappear when you just reduce Warhammer to a game of list building. Sometimes some of the commentary online really revolves around this, thinking about what list beats what. That's fine and I appreciate it's fun to talk about, but I'm not really interested in that myself. I want to see who's the better general, rather than who's designed the best army and is able to 3D print it and contrast paint it in the shortest amount of time. Thus, people looking at my lists compared to the other Bretonnian lists that came second, third and fourth shouldn't draw the conclusion that my list was better than theirs. I've no idea whether it was or not. But a more interesting question to me, and one that I'm not able to answer because I can't compare it, is how I played my games compared to the other Bretonnians. Even in a game which has a very flat competitive meta like Warhammer the Old World, I still think there's an enormous role for how you play the game, and of course the dice that you roll, rather than just the lists that you bring. More broadly, let me say a few words about the state of competitive Old World. Now, as I have said before, the fact that we have a supported game that really feels like Warhammer Fantasy is the indelible full stop at the end of any argument on whether the release of Warhammer the Old World was a good thing. Of course it was a good thing. It was a fantastic thing, because now we are alive and now we can own the future. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't robustly criticise the many flaws there are with this game. The ways in which it falls short of the standard set by previous editions of Warhammer Fantasy and fan projects like the Ninth Age and WAP. And also how it falls short even on its own terms of being as good a game as it could be, given the stylistic changes that they have decided to make. Right, having prepared you for that, I'm afraid that this Grand Tournament, along with the previous tournament at the Triple Crown that you can watch a battle report for on this channel, have left me rather depressed about the current state of competitive Old World. All of the armies and all of the games do feel rather similar. It seems that you've either got to be Double Dragon, 360-degree Bretonnians, Casket and Bow-Shabty Tomb Kings, Fanatic-bearing Goblins, a Scream-led Vampire list, or some variation of Magic Missile versus Pillar Spam, Flying Monsters or Linehammer to have any kind of a chance. The vast majority of infantry, outside of tar pits, as well as core cavalry, remain largely redundant in a world full of heroes and big monsters and a few gamey little cranky things like caskets and fanatics. That's boring, man. I don't want to be ordering from a menu where 3/4 of the stuff is unavailable, and I'm forced to eat burgers and chips followed by Knickerbocker Glory for breakfast, lunch and supper. I realise that 8th edition is not everyone's cup of tea, but in that competitive world, each army had at least 4 or 5 builds where heroes, infantry, that being elite or tar pit, cavalry shooting, artillery, monsters, magic, all had a role and in various proportions. Perhaps more obviously, we had all rather than half of our armies supported. This, I think, brought vastly more diversity to the game. I haven't played enough competitive 6th or 7th edition to really know whether that was also true in those systems as well, but my impression is that there were many more viable builds that could all conceivably finish in the podium of tournaments than there are presently in Warhammer the Old World, where it feels as though there are only 4 or 5. I should reiterate that I am looking at this from a competitive standpoint, and competitive Warhammer is only really a minority pastime, even though it generates a large volume of the online discourse. If you don't care overmuch about the competitive aspects of the game and just want to enjoy fantasy battles in the Warhammer world with the models that you love, you've got my respect. An Old World is as good and arguably better than the previous systems in enabling you to do just that. I should also say to you that while you might feel left out of much of the online discussion of Warhammer the Old World, which centres overwhelmingly on competitive play, you shouldn't be, because in reality you are part of the silent majority. That's not just about being a hobby hero and refusing to engage with the competitive metaverse because you're not up to it. On the contrary, you're part of a much more substantial philosophical tradition. If you've not heard of him, look up Nigel Stillman, on whom I did a video a few months ago on this channel. But you see, my perspective is one of a man who has been bitten by the world of competitive 8th edition and the 9th Age, where the tournament aspect of the game was really refined to a very fine art. That's actually quite a weird, crankish kind of perspective, and I don't think it's one that many people actually share, so you'll have to just bear that in mind when you listen to what I say. I hope to release a discussion session on Warhammer the Old World with my friend D6 Wounds in a couple of weeks, where we'll go into these kind of matters. But one thing I do think, to leave with something slightly more positive, is that while I think some of the fundamentals of Warhammer the Old World are flawed from a competitive perspective, I do think that there is a massive role for missions. And by that I mean missions as a way of making the game better. These are perhaps the most underappreciated aspects of the game, and they're rubbish in the Warhammer the Old World rulebook, just as quite frankly they were rubbish in the 8th edition rulebook as well. But if you look at other gaming systems, especially Kings of War, the Ninth Age, or indeed even Age of Sigmar, there are fantastic ideas for how you can use mission-based play. These often revolve around using fortitude-bearing units, that is, units that have standards. In other words, not heroes and monsters. You can hold the centre of the battlefield, capture objectives on it, break through into your enemy's deployment zone, capture and escape with loot, or destroy certain bits of your opponent's armies for additional bonuses. In the 9th Age, and in some patched versions of 8th edition, we actually used those missions to decide up to 6 of the 20 battle points you could potentially get from a round. We also did that in my own Twin Sentinels Warhammer the Old World tournament earlier this year. That had the effect of making infantry and cavalry in units much more important because only they could score. The Double Dragon Surfer, even if he tabled his opponent, would only win by 14 points to 6 if he also lost the objective. I don't think these missions really solve the problems that there are in this game competitively, but I do think that they would be a way of introducing enormous additional flavour to competitive events, and I'm really hoping that the Matched Play Pack, which is rumoured to be out towards the end of this year, includes those, because that is the best, the most powerful, and the most politically plausible way of improving Warhammer the Old World competitively. And not just competitively, but also narratively, because I think that mission-based play would also suit those who really like their battles to be stories, rather than simple slogfests of who kills each other. Finally, I should say something about Bretonnians. There's been quite a lot of talk online that Bretonnians are overpowered, having come first, second, third and fourth in this tournament, and generally doing very well at other ones too. It will perhaps come as no surprise to you all that I do not agree with this analysis. First of all, I think it's amusing and hilarious and ironic that after being rubbish for about 15 years and no one caring, now suddenly people are in a tiz that Bretonnians are winning things for a few months. Secondly, I don't think that changing the rules regarding the Green Knight or changing the rules round 360-degree heroes would improve Warhammer the Old World that much. Certainly they would nerf Bretonnians, but I don't think they'd do much more than that. Consider that these 360-degree heroes and the Green Knight are an excellent antidote to Dragonhammer. Massive dragons make the game boring. To emasculate this supply of kryptonite would just simply allow Superman to run rampant. That, of course, is the inherent problem with Nerf Hammer. If you just go and whack something that seems too good, you're going to advantage their nearest competition, or the things that they kept in check. This is much like if you eliminate a pest in one part of the ecosystem. You'll find that that pest ate another pest, and there are going to be far more of those, and they might be even worse. What I do think we should use, though, is some kind of comp system, where we do penalise some of the very generically strong things, and that would include the Green Knight and the 360-degree Duke, but it would also include Caskets of Souls, Bow Shabti, Screams, Fanatics, Magic Missiles, Spam, etc. Of course, when I say penalise, I don't mean actually make worse. I mean apply some kind of negative modifier to the number of tournament points that that player gets from the event. This is a system that we've had in 8th edition for many years. If you take some things that are reckoned to be very strong, you might lose a couple of tournament points at the end. Likewise, if you're taking something that's known to be very weak, you might get a couple of positive points. I think Old World could very much benefit from this kind of comp system. It is that version of Old World, one that has missions and a functioning comp system which will be the true evolved version of this new version of the game. It is this version that will be able to stand in the judgment of posterity and be compared with the other giants of the past. At the moment, I'm being critical about something that isn't properly formed, and my criticism is designed to help it become as good as it can be, as quickly as it can be, for the benefit of everybody, competitive players and narrative ones. This is why the voice of dissent is not always the unpatriotic voice. There is of course such a thing as delusional positivity, of a willful ignorance in the past against which the present is so lacking when compared. There is no contradiction between believing that Warhammer the Old World is a brilliant game and that it is also, simultaneously in its present state, the worst edition of the rules released to date. This is of course the paradox of the wise old man looking on. He is able to enjoy the present, and indeed to celebrate those younger than him in doing so. But he also has not forgotten the past. He remembers only too well what it was like then. So, does he bop along to the current tunes and keep his mouth shut? Or does he tap the new generation on the shoulder and say, "Young man, I have something to tell you"?